The operations room was already full when I arrived for the morning briefing. 15 pilots scattered across the chairs, coffee cups in hand, some reviewing iPads with weather data, others talking quietly about routing changes and maintenance delays. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. I recognized most of them from previous flights. Faces I'd seen in passing through crew lounges and terminals over the past 3 years since making captain. The room had that early morning energy, quiet but purposeful, everyone preparing mentally for the day ahead. I found a seat near the back and pulled out my tablet to review the day's assignment. Seattle to Anchorage, then a turnaround back the same day. 5-hour flight each way, crossing some of the most remote territory we flew, over water and mountains where options narrowed quickly. Weather in Anchorage was marginal, snow showers and gusty winds, the kind of conditions that required attention but nothing I hadn't handled before. I scrolled through the NOTAMs and checked the forecast winds aloft, making mental notes of the routing. The pilot next to me shifted in his seat. I'd seen him around but didn't know his name, late 50s probably, the kind of weathered face that suggested decades in the cockpit. Deep lines around his eyes, gray hair cut military short, the bearing of someone who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. He leaned slightly closer and his voice came out low, barely above a whisper, meant only for me to hear. Said I looked too young for captain, asked how old I was, suggested that maybe I should get a few more years as first officer before taking on the responsibility of command. I kept my eyes on my tablet and told him I was 32, had been flying commercially for 10 years, had logged over 7,000 hours. He made a small sound that might have been skepticism or concern, something between a grunt and a sigh. Said that when he was 32, he'd still been building hours in the right seat, that things had changed, that the airline was promoting people faster now than they used to. Implied without quite saying it directly that maybe faster wasn't better, that maybe experience mattered more than checking boxes on a timeline, that maybe there was wisdom in the old way of doing things, in making people wait, in ensuring they'd seen enough to handle what the job could throw at them. The chief pilot entered and the room quieted. He went through the standard briefing items, weather systems moving across the Pacific Northwest, a NOTAM about construction at one of our alternate airports, a reminder about new procedures for de-icing operations. I took notes and tried to focus, tried to ignore the presence of the older pilot beside me, the weight of his unsolicited assessment still hanging in the air between us. He'd planted something, though, a seed of doubt that I didn't want there. After the briefing ended, several pilots lingered to ask questions or discuss specific issues with their flights. I gathered my things and started toward the door, wanted to get to my aircraft and begin the pre-flight, wanted to move into the part of the job where my age didn't matter. The older pilot caught up with me in the hallway, his voice still low but more insistent now. Said he wasn't trying to be difficult, that he was just concerned, that Anchorage in winter weather wasn't a trip for inexperienced captains. Asked if I'd flown the route before, and when I confirmed I had, multiple times he wanted to know how many times exactly. I told him I'd done the Anchorage run at least 20 times as captain, probably 40 or 50 total counting my years as first officer. He nodded, but his expression suggested this wasn't enough, that some threshold existed in his mind that I hadn't yet crossed. Some magic number of trips or years or gray hairs that would suddenly make me qualified in his assessment. He mentioned that he'd been flying to Anchorage for 18 years, that he'd seen every weather pattern and dealt with every possible complication, that the route looked simple on paper but had ways of surprising you. Said that young captains sometimes had excellent technical skills, but lacked the judgment that only came with time, with seeing things go wrong, with developing instincts that couldn't be taught in training. His tone remained polite, almost fatherly, but the message underneath was clear. I thanked him for his concern and said I needed to get to my aircraft. He asked who my first officer was, and when I gave the name, he seemed to relax slightly. Mentioned that at least I'd have someone experienced in the right seat, that my first officer had been with the airline for 15 years, that he'd be able to help if things got complicated. The implication that I'd need help, that I couldn't handle it alone, that my first officer was there to compensate for my inadequacy, settled into my chest. Walking through the terminal, I replayed the conversation, examined it from different angles, tried to determine if his concerns were legitimate professional advice or just another version of the doubt I'd been dealing with since upgrade. Age and gender tangled together in ways that made it hard to separate which bothered people more, the fact that I was 32 or the fact that I was a woman, or the combination of both that somehow seemed to exceed what people could accept. My first officer was already at the gate when I arrived. He was in his mid-40s, solid reputation, someone I'd flown with several times before. We greeted each other and walked to the aircraft together, discussing the weather and the routing and the fuel load. The normal coordination that happened before every flight. He didn't mention my age or question my capability or suggest I wasn't ready. Just treated me like any other captain he'd fly with, which was all I wanted. The pre-flight went smoothly. I walked around the exterior while he checked the cockpit, examining the aircraft in the gray Seattle morning. Snow flurries already starting, even though the real weather was waiting for us in Alaska. Everything looked good. De-icing had been completed. The mechanics had signed off on all the overnight maintenance items. Just another trip north, another 5 hours in the air, another landing at the end. Back in the cockpit, I ran through the checklist with my first officer, our voices falling into the familiar call-and-response rhythm. Battery on, hydraulics checked, fuel pumps verified, flight controls tested. The mechanical precision of it helped settle my mind, pushed aside the older pilot's comments, focused me on the actual work. This was what mattered, these procedures and systems and protocols that had nothing to do with age or perception. We received our clearance and I started the engines, felt them spool up, ran through the after-start checklist. Passengers were still boarding, the usual flow of people moving through the cabin, settling into seats, stowing bags. The lead flight attendant came to the cockpit and confirmed everyone was aboard, asked about the weather in Anchorage, mentioned she'd heard it was pretty rough up there today. I told her we'd have some turbulence and wind on approach, but nothing outside normal parameters, that I'd keep her updated if anything changed. She nodded and left, and I made my announcement to the cabin, welcoming everyone aboard, giving them the flight time and a general weather overview. My voice sounded calm and professional through the PA system, betraying nothing of the morning's conversation, nothing of the doubt that had been planted. Pushback was on time. I taxied toward the runway, following ground control's instructions, the aircraft responding smoothly to my inputs. Seattle was busy this morning. Several departures queued ahead of us, but the flow was steady. We held short of the runway and ran the final checks. Everything configured correctly, everything ready for departure. Tower cleared us for takeoff and I taxied onto the runway, advanced the throttles, felt the acceleration build. Called the speeds as we reached them, heard my first officer confirm, pulled back at rotation speed and felt the nose lift. The gray Seattle morning fell away below us as we climbed, the city and the sound and the familiar geography shrinking into patterns. The climb was smooth despite the snow showers. We leveled off at our assigned altitude and I engaged the autopilot, settled back to monitor the systems. My first officer was handling the radios, coordinating with center, requesting a higher altitude. Everything routine, everything professional, our coordination automatic after years of doing this. About 40 minutes into the flight, he mentioned casually that he'd run into Captain Morrison in the hallway, that Morrison had said something about checking on me, making sure I was comfortable with the Anchorage weather. I felt my jaw tighten and asked what exactly Morrison had said. My first officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then admitted that Morrison had expressed some concern about my experience level, had asked him to keep a close eye on the approach, had suggested he might need to take a more active role than usual. Morrison was the older pilot from the briefing. He'd apparently gone out of his way to find my first officer, to plant seeds of doubt, to suggest I needed supervision. I asked if my first officer had agreed with Morrison's assessment, if he shared the concern about my capability. He was quiet for a moment, then said he thought Morrison was being overly cautious, that he'd flown with me before and had complete confidence in my ability, that age didn't determine competence. I appreciated him saying it, but the damage was already done. Morrison had succeeded in introducing uncertainty, in making my first officer think about my age and experience level when he should just be focusing on standard crew coordination, had created a dynamic where every decision I made would be viewed through that lens, evaluated against some invisible standard that Morrison had established without ever flying with me or observing my actual performance. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. We flew on in silence for a while. I monitored the fuel burn and the weather ahead, checked the forecast for Anchorage, reviewed the approach plates. The winds were stronger than earlier predictions, gusting to 35 knots, but still within limits. Snow showers were expected to continue through our arrival, but visibility was holding above minimums. Challenging conditions, but nothing that required anything beyond standard procedures and attention. My first officer asked if I wanted to brief the approach now or wait until closer to our descent. I told him we'd brief it now, wanted to get it done early, wanted to establish that I was on top of things and not waiting until the last minute. We went through the approach in detail, discussed the winds and the crosswind limits, reviewed the missed approach procedure and our alternate airports, coordinated our responsibilities and callouts. He listened and confirmed everything, asked good questions, made useful observations. If he was watching me more carefully because of Morrison's comments, he didn't show it. Just acted like a professional first officer working with his captain. But I couldn't quite shake the awareness that Morrison's doubt was there in the cockpit with us, invisible but present, coloring everything. The flight continued north. We crossed into Canadian airspace, then out over the Gulf of Alaska, the terrain below changing from forest to water to distant mountains. The landscape this far north always felt different, more remote, more serious somehow. Cities and airports spread farther apart, options for emergencies narrowed, the margin for error tightened. This was why Morrison thought I was too young, why he'd questioned my readiness. This was where experience supposedly mattered most. Anchorage approach began vectoring us about 30 minutes out. The controller's voice had that clipped efficiency that suggested they were busy, multiple aircraft inbound, weather complicating everything. I copied the instructions and my first officer read them back. Our coordination smooth. We started our descent, configured the aircraft, ran through the approach checklist. The turbulence increased as we descended, the aircraft bouncing in the rough air, nothing severe but enough to require constant attention. I disconnected the autopilot and flew manually, wanted to feel the aircraft, wanted direct control. The winds were strong and shifting, the gusts visible in the way the aircraft responded, requiring continuous corrections to maintain the approach path. My first officer was monitoring the instruments and making the required callouts. Altitude, speed, glide slope, everything by the book. I could hear the wind noise increasing, feel the aircraft working in the rough air. This was the kind of approach that separated adequate pilots from good ones, where experience and skill showed themselves not in dramatic gestures, but in small corrections, in reading the conditions, in staying ahead of the aircraft. We broke out of the clouds at 800 feet, the runway visible ahead through blowing snow. The crosswind was strong, requiring a significant crab angle to track the centerline. I made the corrections smoothly, feeling the aircraft respond, adjusting for the gusts. Everything was stable, everything was under control. But it required full attention, constant small inputs, the kind of flying that looked easy but required thousands of hours to make routine. At 500 feet we were stable, on speed, on glide slope, tracking the centerline despite the wind. My first officer confirmed it, his voice calm and professional. I continued the approach, making corrections, reading the wind, feeling the aircraft. At 50 feet I kicked out the crab and aligned with the runway. Transitioned to a side slip to compensate for the crosswind. Felt for the moment of touchdown. The landing was firm but smooth, the kind of landing that handled crosswinds properly, that got the aircraft on the ground and under control without drama. I deployed the thrust reversers and began braking, the aircraft tracking straight despite the wind. My first officer commented that it was a nice piece of flying, that the conditions were trickier than they looked. I acknowledged it briefly, focused on taxiing clear of the runway. We taxied to the gate and completed the shutdown checklist. The lead flight attendant came forward and mentioned that several passengers had commented on the landing, that given the conditions they'd been bracing for something rougher, that they were impressed with how smooth it had been. I thanked her and gathered my things, ready to deplane and stretch during the turnaround. In the terminal, I saw Morrison. He was apparently working a later flight to Anchorage, was standing near a gate agent's desk reviewing paperwork. He looked up when he saw me, his expression somewhere between curiosity and concern, like he was checking to see if I'd survived the approach he'd been so worried about. I nodded at him and kept walking. Didn't stop to engage. Didn't offer a report on how the flight had gone. My first officer and I grabbed coffee and reviewed the weather for the return flight. The winds were expected to ease slightly by our departure time, but snow showers would continue. We discussed the routing and fuel load, coordinated with dispatch, ran through the standard turnaround procedures. Everything normal, everything routine, just another day of flying despite Morrison's attempts to make it something more fraught. Back at the aircraft, we ran through the pre-flight again. Passengers were already boarding for the return to Seattle, the usual mix of business travelers and tourists, people heading home or starting trips. None of them knew or cared how old I was, didn't question whether I had enough experience, just trusted that the airline had put qualified people in the cockpit and that we'd get them where they needed to go safely. The return flight was smoother. The winds had decreased as forecast, the turbulence was lighter, the approach into Seattle was routine. I flew it manually again, wanted to maintain the feel for the aircraft, wanted to stay sharp. The landing was gentle, barely felt, the kind that made passengers applaud sometimes. My first officer commented that I'd had a solid day of flying, that the Anchorage approach in particular had been well executed. Walking through the Seattle terminal after shutdown, I saw Morrison again. He was apparently back from his Anchorage trip, was heading toward the exit with his rolling bag. He made eye contact, and this time he approached. His expression less certain than it had been that morning. Asked how my flights had gone, if I'd had any issues with the weather, if everything had been manageable. I told him both flights had gone smoothly, that the weather had been within parameters, that there hadn't been any problems. He nodded, seemed to be processing this, then said he hoped I didn't take his earlier comments the wrong way, that he'd just been trying to offer guidance based on his experience, that he remembered being a young captain and how challenging it could be, how much pressure there was to prove yourself. I thanked him for his concern, but pointed out that I wasn't a young captain struggling to prove myself, that I was a qualified captain doing my job, that his comments to my first officer had been inappropriate and had created unnecessary doubt. His face reddened slightly, and he started to explain, to justify, but I told him I needed to get going, that I had paperwork to file. Left him standing there, probably surprised that I'd pushed back, probably thinking I was being defensive or oversensitive. The truth was that his doubt had gotten into my head, had made me second-guess myself during the approach, had added an extra layer of pressure that shouldn't have been there. I'd flown well despite it, had executed everything correctly, had proven through performance that his concerns were unfounded. But I shouldn't have had to prove it, shouldn't have had to fly with the added weight of his assessment hanging over me. At home that evening, I thought about the day, about Morrison's comments and my first officer's professionalism and the approaches I'd flown. Thought about how many more times this would happen, how many more older pilots would question my readiness, would suggest I needed more time or more supervision or more something before I could be trusted with the responsibility I already held. The airline had promoted me to captain 3 years ago because I'd met every requirement, passed every test, demonstrated every competency. They'd evaluated my performance and determined I was ready. But that didn't stop individual pilots from making their own assessments, from deciding based on age or appearance or some personal standard that I wasn't quite ready yet, that I needed more seasoning. My phone showed a message from my first officer, brief and professional, saying it had been good flying with me, that he appreciated my handling of the anchorage conditions, that he'd be happy to crew with me anytime. Small gesture, but it mattered. Acknowledgement from someone who'd actually observed my flying rather than making assumptions based on age or gender or preconceived notions about what a captain should look like. The next morning, I had another trip, this time to San Francisco. Different first officer, different route, different weather. The briefing was routine. No one questioned my age or suggested I wasn't ready. Just standard coordination and planning the way it should be. We flew south, handled some moderate turbulence, shot an approach in fog, landed smoothly. Normal day, normal flying. The kind of trip that reminded me why I'd wanted this career. But Morrison's words stayed with me, surfaced at odd moments, made me question whether other pilots were thinking the same thing, but just not saying it. Made me wonder how many times I'd have to prove myself, how many perfect approaches I'd need to fly, how many years would need to pass before people stopped seeing me as too young. The reality was that I was a captain, had the training, the hours, the certifications, the demonstrated competency, had passed the same tests and met the same standards as every other captain in the airline. My age was just a number, irrelevant to my actual capability, meaningful only to people who decided that experience could only come with time, and that time required decades rather than years of focused practice. I kept flying. More trips north, more approaches in weather, more landings in crosswinds, built more hours, gained more experience, demonstrated competency day after day. Some flights were routine and unremarkable. Others were challenging and required everything I'd learned. All of them added to the evidence that I belonged in the left seat, that I could handle the responsibility. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. Months passed. The seasons changed. I saw Morrison occasionally in briefings or in terminals, and we nodded at each other with professional courtesy, but nothing more. He never mentioned his earlier concerns again, never asked about my flights, never offered more unsolicited guidance. Maybe he'd decided I was old enough now, or maybe he'd just moved on to questioning someone else. Other older pilots made similar comments from time to time, subtle suggestions that I was promoted too fast, that standards had changed, that maybe the airline was more focused on diversity than on experience. I developed responses that were polite but firm, that acknowledged their perspective while making clear that my qualifications were not up for debate, that I'd earned my position through performance rather than any shortcut. The flying itself became my answer. Every smooth approach, every good decision, every professional interaction with crew and controllers and passengers. The cumulative weight of competent performance that eventually made the questions seem ridiculous, made the doubt appear baseless, made the concern about age look like what it was, an excuse for discomfort with something that challenged expectations. I turned 33, then 34. The questions about being too young became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Some threshold existed in people's minds, some age at which I'd suddenly be old enough, experienced enough, seasoned enough. I never quite reached it, Or maybe the threshold kept moving, always staying just ahead of wherever I actually was. But the flying continued. The approaches kept coming. The weather challenged and tested and proved. The aircraft responded to skilled inputs regardless of the age of the hands on the controls. The physics of flight remained neutral, indifferent, honest. And in that honesty, in that pure mechanical relationship between pilot and machine, I found the validation that no amount of others' approval could provide. Because I wasn't too young for this. Had never been too young. Was exactly the right age, the right experience level, the right amount of capable for every flight I'd flown and every flight I'd fly. Morrison and pilots like him could question and doubt and suggest I needed more time. But the aircraft never questioned. The approaches never doubted. The landings never suggested I wasn't ready. And ultimately, that was what mattered. Not the opinions of pilots who decided my age disqualified me, not the whispered concerns or the unsolicited advice or the suggestions that I needed more supervision. Just the flying, just the work, just the daily demonstration that I could do this job, had always been able to do it, would continue doing it regardless of who thought I was too young. The uniform went on each day, the pre-flight checklist got run, the engine started, the aircraft responded, the passengers trusted, the job got done. And that was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be enough, regardless of what anyone whispered before the briefing started. The doubt was theirs to carry, not mine. I had the flying. I had the skill. I had the proof of thousands of hours and hundreds of approaches and countless smooth landings. I had the reality of competence demonstrated daily. That was all I needed. That was all that mattered. Everything else was just noise, the background static of people uncomfortable with change, with youth, with capability that didn't match their expectations. But noise didn't fly aircraft. Noise didn't land planes in crosswinds. Noise didn't keep passengers safe. Skill did that. Training did that. Experience did that. And experience came from doing, not just from aging. I was 34 and I was a captain and I was good at my job. Those three facts existed simultaneously, independently, irrefutably. Morrison's whisper couldn't change any of them. Couldn't make me younger or older or more or less capable. Could only reveal his own discomfort. His own inability to reconcile what he saw with what he expected. That was his problem to solve, not mine. My problem was flying well, making good decisions, keeping people safe. And that problem I solved every single day, every single flight, every single approach. Without drama, without fanfare, without needing anyone's permission or approval or validation beyond the simple mechanical truth of wheels touching runway smoothly, engines spooling down, passengers deplaning safely. That was the job. That was what mattered. That was what I'd keep doing, one flight at a time, one briefing at a time, one whispered doubt at a time, until the whispers didn't matter anymore. Until the only sound that counted was engines starting and wheels lifting and voices coordinating and aircraft responding. The pure, honest sound of flying done well, by someone who was exactly the right age for it, no matter what anyone else thought.